You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast and the Future Tech Health Podcast. I have Alyssa Crittenden. She's an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology, an adjunct associate professor at the School of Medicine, and a nutritional anthropologist who works among the Hadza hunter-gatherers of Tanzania, East Africa, which is pretty cool. Her interests include the evolution of the human diet, the evolution of childhood, development of kids' pro-social behavior, and the divisions of labor between the sexes. Today we're going to focus more on the food part of her learning. You know, that hunter-gatherers, how did they actually eat? So, Alyssa, thanks for coming. How you doing?
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm doing okay.
Yeah. So I wonder if you, more than anyone, either do or do not cringe when someone mentions the Paleo Diet, because probably because of your interactions with the Hadza, that you actually do know what people ate, you know, back then or now as hunter-gatherers. So can you talk a little bit about your experiences with them and what you learned?
I can. I would say to answer the first part of your question, whether or not I cringe, I think it depends on whether or not we're talking about the paleo diet, like the huge diet craze and fitness craze and lifestyle craze that we're experiencing in the cultural West right now, or whether you actually mean the Paleolithic diet, right? Because I have very strong opinions on both. And of course, they're not actually the same thing, which we can unpack later throughout our chat. But yeah, I've learned
let's start with that.
Oh, you want to start with that?
Let's start with that, and then we'll go forward. Yeah.
The Hadza are certainly part of that. They're certainly part of kind of my thinking on this and what I've learned from them. So, as your question kind of indicated, the paleo diet we've probably all heard of, and I'm asked to talk about that a lot, and I get asked about it by my students quite frequently, and whether or not we should be eating a quote-unquote paleo diet and what it actually means. And I think those of us who are nutritional anthropologists like myself, who study human nutrition in an evolutionary context, but also are really interested in how our past nutrition can potentially impact our contemporary diet choices also. I think for those of us, it's a very interesting and important distinction. So the paleo diet is this move, essentially, which is, if you Google it, I mean, I can't even imagine how many hits you would get. It's also sometimes called the caveman diet, and it's a craze, but it actually started, this kind of dietary movement started in the 1960s. So there was a book that was originally published by anthropologist and a medical doctor, that it was called the Paleolithic prescription. And it was this idea that our forebears, our ancestors, that they had a much healthier diet than we consume now, and that was in the 20th century, but it extends into today, into the 21st century. And it was this kind of, it proposed this idea of evolutionary mismatch. So this idea that we evolved under certain selection pressures in our evolutionary past to consume a certain type of diet with a certain level of physical activity, which was often associated with getting those foods out of the environment and into our bodies, and that we have moved very far away from that. So we're kind of Stone Agers, living in the fast lanes. That idea was originally proposed then. There's a really cool book that just There's a Kindle version available now. It's called Neander Thin, and it's kind of like this caveman guide to diet and health. And that book was also from the 60s, and it was out of print for a while. But as I said, there's a Kindle version now, so people, if they're really interested, kind of to see how this movement started, they can go there. And then
it's called Neander Thin.
Neander Thin, yeah. If you can find it on Amazon.
What do they recommend? All you have to do is like run 15 miles a day and spend like 5,000 calories getting your food. And you'll be fine.
Well, I encourage you to read the book. It's written by a couple of different authors. One of them is Ray Audette, I believe, and Troy Gilchrist, I think, was another one. And it was a caveman's guide to nutrition. So it's kind of like the first iteration, or one of the first, not the first, but one of the first iterations of this, of kind of this idea that there's a diet, like essentially where you eat low carbohydrates, and it's a really effective way to essentially stay healthier and live longer is to modify what you're eating. And this concept of the actual phrase paleo diet was trademarked by Lauren Cordain, who wrote the book on the paleo diet. And so it really is like any other type of diet, like any other type of popular diet, like that you go on, that you would read about in, I don't know, Time magazine, or that you would hear about on the news. It's just a popular diet. And the idea is to try and eat as closely as you can to our Paleolithic ancestors, which of course is actually scientifically impossible to do. But the idea that you should be eating foods that are more closely aligned with what we would have eaten before the Neolithic Revolution, so before domesticated crops. So it's really heavily meat-based, and it involves things like quinoa and rice as your grains, not a lot of other processed types of grains. There's things like pasta would be out, using ghee instead of butter, cooking with things like avocado. And of course, there's no one paleo diet. There are so many different iterations of this diet. But basically what I tell my students is the basic idea is it's fairly meat heavy, although there are plants. There's almost no processed foods in the quote unquote paleo diet that you would get from a cookbook, diet book. And whether or not this leads to longevity or to healthier outcomes is completely up for debate. It's not considered by clinical nutritionists to even actually be the healthiest diet. And it's certainly not the diet that we were necessarily adapted to, because most of those plant foods and all of the animal products that I just mentioned, of course, are domesticated animals and are domesticated crops. So if you really want to eat like a hunter-gatherer, it's almost impossible, given that we live in the post-industrialized West. So should you or should you not eat a paleo diet? I'm not here to offer any type of dietary advice. What I often tell my students is that I think that a reduction in processed foods is the best way to go. I tell them to shop on the periphery of the grocery store, to go to farmers markets, try to stay away from a lot of those really highly processed foods that are in the middle of the store. Although who doesn't love Oreos, right? But Oreos, actually, interestingly enough, are vegan. So we could talk about how many types of foods you want to eat and what is and is not a healthy diet all day long. But I think from the anthropological perspective, from my perspective as a nutritional anthropologist, the point is to really gain a better understanding of how the contemporary understanding of the popular paleo diet is not actually what we as scientists think about when we think about the Paleolithic diet, which is the diet that our ancestors were likely consuming. And that we think about those types of foods. And the reason we are so interested in the Paleolithic diet from a scientific perspective is that there's a pretty much a general consensus by most scientists who study evolutionary anthropology and human evolutionary biology that changes in our diet around 2.5 million years ago those changes are one of the significant things that led to the evolution of our genus and ultimately to our species. And so what we were eating and what
would you say particularly the evolution of our brains, or is it?
I would say that's that's a good question. I would say that's very much part of it. And I would say that most people associate the enlargement in brain growth that you see around that time with a switch to higher quality food resources.
Have you observed directly from the Hadza, like what have you learned that surprised you or is different?
Working with the Hadza has been such a gift. It's been one of the most amazing experience. I've been working with them since 2004, and I started working with them because I was really interested in learning more about what kind of current day hunter-gatherers could tell us about the evolution of human diet and kind of how those dietary choices and dietary behaviors, food collection behaviors that they were engaging in kind of rolled into and impacted social behavior and culture and reproductive and health outcomes. So I have learned so much working with the Hadza. In relationship particularly to food, I would say if there were some big insights or takeaway messages that I've kind of gleaned over the last 15 years, I would say that data coming from the Hadza kind of underscores this point that plant foods actually make up the basis of most forager diets in contemporary settings and in subtropical ecosystems. So outside of like circumpolar Arctic regions, for most populations, contrary to popular belief that it's all meat and marrow, what you see is that a lot of these foragers are really consuming the majority of their diet is plant-based and then punctuated with meat. So meat's important, and meat was likely very important in the Paleolithic past, but it's pretty well established now that we think that the majority of diet was plant-based, and then was meat contributed some important things like fat and protein and iron to a largely plant-based diet. So that was one insight. And I would think the other one is just to move away from this kind of meat and potatoes debate, right? This idea, was it plant foods or was it meat? Which one was more important? We're omnivores. We evolved to be omnivores. It's a really important part of our legacy, of the history of our species. And so really other foods are important too. Like the Hadza consume a lot of honey. It's actually the most highly ranked food. And it's not just the liquid honey, it's also the larva. So they kind of consume the entire package of honeycomb. And I think that working with them has also led to really important insights that things like honey consumption may have been potentially really important in our evolutionary past as well.
So, all right. So even before people domesticated crops and everything, what was their day like? Like, did they eat still plants just raw most of the time? Did they get meat rarely because they had hunted down and just wasn't around that much? I mean, did they eat like one meal every other day or 3 meals a day? Like, what are some of the particulars of what you learned?
Right. Well, I can tell you about the Hadza, and then I'll tell you kind of how we can infer about our past from working with populations like the Hadza. So the Hadza are a modern population. They're a contemporary population, just as modern as you and me. But the reason that they're so interesting to scientists is that they are semi-nomadic. They don't keep any crops. They don't have any herd animals. They primarily live off the land, collecting wild plant foods and hunting game animals. Increasingly, their diet is being altered year by year with the introduction of domesticated cultigens, with the introduction of things like corn or wheat or barley from missionary groups, from government aid organizations, you name it. You know, climate change is real and it's impacting everyone, even foragers living in these small communities. So their diet is changing, but their diet is still predominantly, at least the groups that I work with, is still largely based on wild foods. And what we can learn about studying the Hadza diet, what we can learn about the past suggests that our Paleolithic ancestors, so our hunter and gather ancestors, may have been exploiting similar resources and similar types of ecosystems. For over 95% of human evolutionary history, we were hunter-gatherers, which is why we look to forager diets in order to kind of inform our understanding. The whole concept of a meal or 3 meals a day or breakfast is the best meal, all of that is all culturally specific. There's nothing in clinical nutrition or nutrition science or even in human biology that would suggest that we're supposed to have 3 meals a day. Or I have a lot of friends who say, well, I only eat 2 meals a day and then I snack, but that's the most important thing. Or I have colleagues who say, well, we should graze all day. We shouldn't have meals. We should just eat small amounts all day, just like hunter-gatherers. Well, hunter-gatherer diet is, first of all, there's not one pan-forager diet. It's based on ecological variation. It's based on seasonal variation. It's based on seasonal availability of foods. So sometimes, depending on the resource, if you're a hunter-gatherer, you may be foraging throughout the day. Depending on the resource, you might not be. You might have long periods where you're essentially fasting, and then somebody comes in with a zebra, or the women come in with a huge collection, a huge amount of underground storage organs or tubers, which are really fibrous plant root species. So I think it's the take-home message is that it's variable, and that one of the things that we have evolved in terms of not only our digestive system and our dentition, which are really kind of interesting ways to look at how our bodies evolved to consume certain types of foods. But one of the most interesting things behaviorally is also that we're flexible. We're a flexible species. And that flexibility in terms of what we eat, when we eat it, and how we eat it is one of the things that's allowed us to be such a reproductively successful species, outcompete other hominin species who were living at the same time as us, and essentially successfully occupy every corner of the earth. And it's this ecological and dietary flexibility which really is one of the hallmarks of human evolution. Not that we were that we evolved.
Yeah, so the thing that's new is the ability for us to actually to be to eat in the same way for a long period of time. So it sounds like what you're saying is, eating one way or another may or may not be good, but we're able to do things consistently, whereas people years ago couldn't do that kind of thing because of the availability of food, the types of food.
Oh, so you mean like contemporary times? Well, I'm still talking about our evolutionary past in terms of. So you mean?
No, I'm comparing the two. Like, I could now, for instance, if I wanted to do whatever, the Paleo Diet or the Mediterranean diet, I could do that for years at a time, no problem, if I wanted to. But back in the day, there was no one diet or way of eating because it was modulated by climate and availability of food, and et cetera.
That's right.
So
you got it, absolutely. So
people's diets were varied. That's the difference.
Yeah, they were varied. They were ecologically variable, and they were seasonally variable. And what we know is they were predominantly plant-based, and they did also have animal protein and insect protein that would be involved in there. But I think that what everybody that you know probably in your life eats a different diet, right? Everybody kind of adheres to a different type of dietary regime, whether that is meal times or the specific foods they eat. And your point is well taken. That actually is our evolutionary legacy. The fact that we can eat so many different foods in so many different subsistence regimes. Like here, I'm talking to you in a climate-controlled room where I can at any moment basically access whatever amount of food I want to access. I have clean drinking water. I can go to the grocery store. I can go to restaurants. We have a community garden plot right down the street. This is incredibly rare, even in our world today, even in the 21st century. This is very, very rare. Most of the world does not have that luxury of being able to just eat whatever they feel like it in whatever moment they feel like it. And so I also think it's important to pay attention not only to our past, but also to the different types of dietary choices and the different access to food and water that people right now in 2019 have all around the world. That is our legacy, is that we can eat all sorts of different foods. And that's actually what we were adapted to do.
Right, but I think people tend to eat a certain subset of foods for a very long time, and that's very different from the way people, evolved over time, is what you're saying.
I wouldn't say that I'm saying that at all. I mean, I think that depending on what ecosystem... Well,
I'm saying it. What do you think?
Oh, you're saying it. I don't know if I would agree with that. I think depending on what ecosystem you lived in as a forager, 200,000 years ago, you were going to be limited to some extent because of what was available in your environment. Today, in 2019, people are really limited to what they can eat based on their access to foods, based on their zip code, based on what country they live in. Some people still eat the same types of foods over and over and over again for most of their lives. I think it really depends on where you live right now in the world, in terms of how diverse your diet actually is.
What do you think about Andrew Zimmern from Bizarre Foods? He's probably eaten more different foods for longer than anyone that's existed forever.
Oh, I don't actually know about that. I can't offer an opinion. I'm not familiar with that.
For years he had a TV show. He had a TV show where he'd literally travel all around the world and try all the local cuisine. So I thought he's a funny person because, again, his gut microbiome must be like unbelievably varied, or at least he's eaten more different foods than probably anyone in the world has because of all his travel.
Maybe. Let's see. I haven't seen the show, but I can say kind of from a academic standpoint, I have two comments. The first would be that his microbiome may be more diverse, but also we know now that the gut microbiome is really heavily impacted, not just by diet, but by what environment you live in. So the soil that you're around, the types of plant materials in the air that you're breathing, the water that you're drinking, whether or not you use antibiotics, whether or not you use antibacterial hand soap. I mean, so I think that it's possible, but also we can't just tether it directly and only to diet. And my other point would be he may be the person in the world who's had the most diverse diet. And that's fascinating from kind of a interesting media perspective or cultural perspective. But also what an amazing life to actually have the ability to do that. That's definitely a first world conundrum, how you get around the world to eat that many different foods, right? Most of us don't have that.
It's a delicious conundrum.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
So what are some of the other surprising things that you've learned from your studies that, weren't obvious to you before, or, maybe you tell friends about and they're like, what are you talking about?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that kind of surprises people is when I start talking about the importance that insects potentially had in our evolutionary past and kind of the long history of the human sweet tooth. So talking about honey in particular and then kind of extending that to talking about insects in general. I think that not only is it really interesting to think about insects as human food in the past, but I also think that that's where the future of food is trending. So anyone who takes my classes or goes to a party with me or has, grabs a beer at a bar with me, I'm probably likely, if you get me talking about my work too much, I'm probably very likely to start talking about how important it is to eat bugs. So I think that that's kind of something that has really how my thinking has evolved over the past decade, working very closely with the Hadza and also just kind of really paying attention and kind of taking the temperature of what's happening in the world as we're coming up with all sorts of new ways to make our food system more sustainable globally. I think that that's a cool thing that tethers us from the past, from probably the very beginning of our genus Homo 2.5 million years ago until right now in the 21st century. I think there has been that really interesting connection with edible insects that to me is really interesting and surprising.
Well, I guess a lot of jokes here. Like my dogs love to eat flies and moths, but that's an aside. But I saw like on Shark Tank this company that was making cricket flour, for use in foods, and you couldn't even tell it was a bug. But for people that
awesome.
Even want to eat bugs, how do you get ones that aren't like covered in pesticides or like good ones, or I guess you got to rely on a big company making them and selling them. But do people even in the U.S. even have access to insects, even if they wanted to eat them?
Oh, that's such a good question. So, yes, the answer is yes. The short answer is yes, absolutely. The long answer is, as you might imagine, a little bit longer. Basically, what we know now is a lot of people all around the world who work for big, who not only work for corporations that are trying to kind of change the agricultural industry and kind of think about the way that humans can sustainably keep eating animal protein, and also groups like the UN are starting to put more research and time and energy into looking at ways that we can consume insects. And so the first thing is I'm an anthropologist. So part of my job when I teach my university classes is to remind my students that what we do here in the U.S. Is not necessarily normative or normal, that this is what we do, right? To make sure that they don't have this ethnocentric idea that everything that we do here, that's kind of the standard. It's what we do, but it's not what the world does. So much of the world eats insects and does so readily and routinely, and to great culinary delight. And so I think that's also really important to keep in mind, is that a lot of the world's already eating insects. Here in the U.S., we have this kind of ick factor when it comes to it. And I'm hoping, along with many others, that this disappears. But yes, if you would like to try to incorporate insect protein into your diet, you can pretty easily do so. You can buy things like the cricket powder. You can buy that stuff online, on Amazon, on all sorts of other types of online grocers. There are many different small-scale insect farms around the country, around the world, but increasingly here in the U.S. And they're making strides, one bug at a time. These small-scale, usually they're in shipping containers, and they are producing insects for commercial consumption, crickets, which, we talked about, or things like mealworms or even ants, grasshoppers, all of these things. They're not only can you buy some of them online, but a lot of high-end restaurants in big cities like New York and San Francisco, my hometown city, are incorporating menu items that include insects. So it's becoming increasingly common for foodies here in the U.S. to eat insects, and so hopefully this trend will continue. There's a lot of information available if people are interested in kind of learning more about this. One of my very favorite online resources for this, and also it's really educational, provides a lot of information, but also just the name of it is Little Herds. So you can go to this website, Little Herds, and you can kind of hear about how most of the experts in the field are talking about the way that we can use edible insects to feed the future. So there's a lot out there for people who are interested.
So why eat them? I mean, I guess it's more sustainable to raise them, and they don't need vast tracts of land to graze on, and like cows. But I mean, what are some of the reasons to eat insects, health-wise, resources-wise?
I think the argument is resources-wise. So the world's appetite, and the world's appetite for meat in particular, is growing, and our planet is not. So according to United Nations, the Food and Agriculture Organization, so FAO, about 60% of the world's ice-free land surface is currently, right now, dedicated to raising crops and providing grazing land for the animals that we eat. So big animals, way bigger than bugs, right? So this land supports about roughly, let's see if I can remember the numbers, 360 million cattle roughly, and about 600 million sheep and goats. So, I mean, this is a lot of land, right? So up until very recently, our history as a species involved living in close proximity to the livestock and the crops that fed us. This is changing, and this is changing at a drastic rate. So at the turn of the last century, around the year 1900, about 40%, let's just take the U.S. as an example, about 40% of the U.S. population was composed of farmers. Okay, 40%. Today, it's less than 1%. These farmers here in the U.S. operate over 2 million farms that cover over 900 million acres of U.S. land. So this generates all sorts of food and fuel for us and for the animals that we're consuming. And farmers are using a lot of modern techniques. So increasingly, they need less labor to grow their crops. But even so, we're talking about a lot of land, and we're talking about far fewer farmers, right? So a lot of land, no new farms, really. Most of the world's rural population is now moving into cities, and due to decreasing rainfall and poor soils, this means that a lot of productivity is declining. So all of these are things that we're contending with, and expanding the range of crop species and the types of animal protein that can sustain humanity, like incorporating insects to the diet, is arguably one of the most sustainable choices that we can do in terms of kind of changing the way that our world eats.
Okay, so where are you going with your research and your anthropology? What's next that you want to study, or what's really intriguing you right now?
What's really intriguing me right now? Well, kind of where I'm going next is very different than, so I'm going to answer that in two ways. So my work with the Hadza is trending towards better understanding what dietary transition looks like and what the impacts of that might be. So what happens when you start introducing things like maize into a forager diet at the beginning? So we're at early stages where foragers are kind of, for the first time, we have the ability as scientists and also as the world watching, right, who's interested in knowing about this stuff and in participating in any way that may be beneficial to the communities being studied. What are the impacts of incorporating these types of domesticated foods into a wild foraging diet? And what kind of impacts does that have in terms of health, in terms of infant well-being, in terms of nutrition status, all of that stuff? So I'm working a lot on that right now. I'm working a lot on water and hydration strategies, and thinking a lot about water in the world and how small-scale populations like the Hadza in particular get access to water. In terms of kind of my larger academic interests and stuff that I read about and think about and talk about in terms of public media stuff, I'm really interested in the future of food, some of the stuff we just talked about with insects, but I'm also really interested in some stuff that kind of seems fringe, but it actually isn't fringe at all. So stuff like tissue engineering or growing test tube meat, or what some people call cultured meat. I'm really interested in that technology and how that might kind of change the way that we think about food. And so I read a lot about that stuff. Some even suggest that very soon we're going to be able to create edible animal tissue in 3D printers. And I'm just fascinated by lab-grown meat in general. And so that's something that kind of piques my interest, that I follow closely in the literature.
Is anyone trying to make lab-grown insects?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm sure they may down the line, right? I mean, this idea is sounds really futuristic, but it's actually not new. This idea that you can create this test tube meat. One interesting little fact that I always like to throw in there is this is something that Winston Churchill predicted back in the 1930s. He wrote a piece in 1932 called Predictions for 50 Years Hence. And in there, he talks about how it's ridiculous that to think that in the future we're going to be spending the time and energy and space and resources to grow a whole chicken, as livestock. And that he argued that soon we'd be able to grow a chicken wing or a chicken leg in a dish. So while the technology is new, this tissue engineering is new, the idea is quite old. If you're wondering, which I know you probably aren't, but I think about this a lot, so maybe you are, the first lab-grown hamburger was actually cooked and eaten in 2013 in London, so not that long ago. It was created by a team of researchers from the Netherlands, from Maastricht University, and it was it was 5 pounds, roughly, 5-pound patty, and it cost them over $300,000 to produce. So we're not there yet. We're far away from the point of time where you and I can eat, a test tube burger. But I think it's coming.
I've interviewed a lot of those companies, and there's some of them have created burgers and stuff, but they're kind of like a muscle burger. And if you think of like a regular burger, there's a lot of fat and marbling and different types of tissues and cells, and so I think it's going to be a long way to go, but we will get there to really make meat that is similar to the meat we get.
Yeah, we're far, but I mean, I think it's really interesting, and it's something to really think about. And I'm also really interested in things like vertical farming. I'm not sure if you've covered that in the stuff that you guys cover, but that's another thing that's actually not in the future. Like that's happening, right? It's happening right now, and I think that it's exciting. I think that humans have a very, very long and intimate connection with the food that they eat, and I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the way that humans interact with their environment and interact with their with the foods that they choose to eat, and how they choose to process them when they eat them, and that extends back to our Paleolithic ancestors and to right now. What happens in my own kitchen and in restaurants where I choose to go eat. And so I think that connection for me is really so much a part of the human condition, kind of the long history we have with our food. And so no matter what I move to in the future in terms of my research, this will always kind of be central to the questions that I'm asking.
I can tell you my own little anthropological experiment I encourage everyone to do is go to, in your neighborhood, a real low-end supermarket and look at the people that shop there, and then go to like a really high-end supermarket, and you'll literally see almost like a different species of people. They look so different. I've done that in a day from one to another, and it's amazing the difference.
Wow. I mean, all the same species. Just want to throw that out there for listeners. We are all the same species. But I think your take-home message is that we also need to pay attention to things like privilege and access to resources and income, because that really affects the nutritional choices that you're able to make in our country and around the world. And I think that's a really important point to remember, that we are so lucky living in the U.S. And even there are so many people in the U.S. who don't have the ability to have all the nutritional freedom that they would like. They don't have the ability to. There are people living in food deserts. Many, 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 many people in the U.S. are living in food deserts. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting kind of sociological commentary and economic commentary and political commentary that we could overlay on the top of this. But I think that that's a very important take-home message for your listeners, is to remember that access to adequate nutrition is a privilege, and unfortunately, it's not a right, and it should be.
Yeah, I mean, one last closing thought is, I've been to conferences like health conferences where I'm probably literally the only one, maybe one other person out of 400 people that's overweight. And I've been to other places where like everyone's just in god awful shape. So it's amazing the difference. And food is a huge modulator on people's health and all that, whether they have choice or not. But I just see the
That's
effects
right.
in doing my little experiments,
Right. And it's also, I think that's a really great point. And I think it's also important to remember, too, that many people in the world, many low-income and high-risk populations in the world are dealing with kind of a double burden. They're dealing with a double burden of being malnourished and having poor access to good nutrition, and also they're obese, and those often go hand in hand. So, calorie dense and nutrient poor food is a problem. And that's what we see happening kind of all over the world, is this kind of double burden. And so I think, to talk about the obesity pandemic and not talk about economics is irresponsible. So I'm really happy to hear you talk about that, because I think you're 100% right. It's a political issue and not just a nutritional one. And that's really, that was a keen observation that most people don't really make when they're asking me these questions about diet.
Well, I guess maybe it's being overweight for a very long time, opens my eyes in a little bit different way, but no problem.
Well, absolutely.
So what is the best way for people to learn more, read or see what you're doing and working on, and maybe even contact you for collaboration or ideas?
Oh man. Well, let's see. I didn't expect that question. I didn't usually get asked that question. You can find me online. I am a professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I'm easily findable on my university's website. I recently did a course for the company Great Courses in conjunction with National Geographic. And so if people are interested, they can also, they can go there, they can look for it. I know that some of the classes, some of the individual lessons are available on Audible. So I think depending on what topic you're really interested in, you could maybe pick one there. The course for Nat Geo and Great Courses is called Food Science in the Human Body. What else? I think my mom tells me that there's some YouTube videos of me talking about the evolution of human diet floating around. I can't watch them. It's hard for me to, it's sometimes so weird to see yourself like animated in real movement like that if you're not used to being right on camera. And a lot of those talks were done through the Center for Academic Research and Training in Anthropology, or CARTA, through University of California, San Diego. So you can probably find some of those. And otherwise you can just, I'm sure if you Google Paleo Diet just on the internet, you'll find more resources and references than you ever wanted to know in your life. Very few of them are contributed by me, but the information is out there for anyone who is interested. And let's see, what else would I leave people with?
That's a lot of research.
Yeah, here's one that's unrelated to my research, but I want to do a plug for this. I have a colleague and a friend who runs the Rocky Mountain Micro Ranch in Denver, Colorado. And it's Colorado's first and only edible insect farm. And their motto is, we're bringing micro livestock back to the range. And I would just also, if people are really interested in learning more about that, I would encourage them to go there and do some Googling, because it's pretty interesting stuff.
Very cool. Well, Alyssa, thanks for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. This was really fun.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.